Welcome to this model. In this presentation, I am going to speak about diathermies. Diathermy is the treatment process by which cutting, coagulation of tissues are obtained. High frequency currents, apart from their usefulness for therapeutic applications, can also be used in operating rooms for surgical purposes involving cutting and coagulation. The frequency of currents used in surgical diathermy units is in the range of 1 to 3 MHz, in contrast with the much higher frequencies employed in shortwave therapeutic diathermy machines. And this frequency is quite high in comparison with that of 50 Hz main supply. So this is necessary to avoid the intense muscle activity and the electrocution hazards which occur if lower frequencies are employed. The power levels required for electrosurgery are below the threshold for neural stimulation, provided that the diathermy frequency is in the frequency range. And the frequency is at least 300 kHz. Both the Faradic and electrolytic effects are largely eliminated during the flow of current through the human tissues. So this then allows the exclusive utilization of the thermal effect in the high frequency surgery, providing both applications for cutting and coagulations. Diathermy means through heating or producing deep heating directly in the tissues of the body. And this is achieved by the application of electrical energy through electrodes at high frequencies in order to avoid stimulation of motor or sensory nerves. Externally applied sources of heat like hot towels, infrared lamps, and electric heating pads often produce discomfort and skin burns long before adequate heat has penetrated into the deeper tissues. But with the diathermy technique, the subject's body becomes a part of the electrical circuit and the heat is produced within the body and not transferred through the skin. For their action, surgical diathermy machines depend on the heating of electric current. When high frequency current flows through the sharp edge of a wire loop or band loop or the point of the needle into the tissue, there is a high concentration of current at this point. The tissue is heated to such an extent that the cells which are immediately under the electrode are torn apart by the boiling of cell fluid. The indifferent electrode establishes a large area contact with the patient, and the RF current is therefore dispersed so that very little heat is developed at this electrode. This type of tissue separation forms the basis of electrosurgical heat cutting. So, electrosurgical coagulation of tissue is caused by the high frequency current flowing through the tissue and heating it locally so that it coagulates from inside. The coagulation process is accompanied by grayish-white discoloration of the tissue at the edge of the electrode. The term fulguration refers to the superficial tissue destruction without affecting deep-seated tissues. This is undertaken by passing sparks from a needle or a ball electrode of small diameter to the tissue. When the electrode is held near the tissue without touching it, an electric arc is produced whose heat dries out the tissue. Fulguration permits fissulas and residual cysts to be cauterized and minor harmonic hedges has to be stopped. In desiccation, needle point electrodes are stuck into the tissue and then kept steady. Depending upon the intensity and duration of the current, a high local increase in heat will be obtained and the tissue changes due to drying and limited coagulation. Another advantage of diathermy is that the treatment can be controlled precisely. The heating of the tissues is carried out by high frequency alternating current, which generally has a frequency of 27.12 MHz and a wavelength of 11 meters. Currents of such high frequencies do not stimulate motor or sensory nerves, nor do they produce any muscle contraction. Thus, when such a current is passed through the body, no discomfort is caused to the subject. So, we can summarize the advantages of diathermy as selective treatment is possible and the affected tissues can alone be treated without affecting the neighboring tissues. Precise control over the heat produced is possible, that is, the treatment can be controlled precisely. As the body becomes a part of the electric circuit, the heat is not transferred through the skin. As the high frequency alternating current is used, there will be no stimulation of motor or sensory nerves and hence no discomfort to the patient. And the treatment can be controlled easily. Use of appropriate electrodes permit the heat to be localized only in the region to be treated. Amount of heat that is to be delivered can be adjusted accurately. Interlying tissues, muscles, bones, internal organs can be provided with heat by using high frequencies. And the main disadvantages of diathermy are it is not capable of producing depolarization, contraction of muscles, wavelengths are too short, and tissue temperature increases, and increased blood flow, increased venous flow, changes in the physical properties of tissues and muscle relaxation. So the use of high frequency offers a number of important advantages. The separation of tissues by electric current always takes place immediately in front of the cutting edge and is not caused by it. Electrical cutting therefore doesn't require any application of force. Instead, it facilitates the elegant and effortless surgery. The electrode virtually melts through the tissue instantaneously and seals the capillary and other vessels, thus preventing contamination by bacteria. A simplified method of coagulation saves valuable time since bleeding can be arrested immediately by touching the spot briefly with a coagulation electrode. A high-frequency apparatus is regarded as standard equipment in the operating theatre and it is kept ready for all surgical interventions even if high-frequency surgery is not intended, so that use can be made of its superior method of electrocoagulation. And the machines that achieve this by combining two waveforms can consist of an active and reference electrode, that is indifferent electrode. And the biological tissue can only be cut when the voltage between the cutting electrode and the tissue to be cut is high enough to produce electric arcs between the cutting electrode and the tissue. The temperature produced at the points at which the electric arcs contact the tissue, like microscopic flashes of lightning, are so high that the tissue is immediately evaporated or burned away. A voltage of approximately 200 Vp is required in order to produce the electric arc between the metal electrode and the biological tissues. If the voltage is less than 200 Vp, the electric arcs cannot be triggered and the tissues cannot be cut. The voltages that is suitable for cutting the biological tissue ranges from 200 Vp and 500 Vp, and if the voltage rises above 500 Vp, the electric arcs become so intense that the tissue is increasingly carbonized and the cutting electrode may be damaged. A visible arc forms when the electric field strength exceeds 1 kilovolt per millimeter in the gap and disappears when the field strength drops below a certain threshold level. Biological tissues are coagulated by thermal means, and if the requested temperature is maintained at around 70 degrees Celsius. And this coagulation method, that is in desiccation, needle point electrodes are stuck into the tissue and then kept safely, and depending upon the intensity and duration of the current, a high local increase in heat will be obtained and the tissue changes due to drying and limited coagulation. And next, let us discuss about the types of diathermy. There are majorly 4 types of diathermies are available in the medical field, called shortwave diathermy, ultrasonic diathermy, microwave diathermy, and surgical diathermy. Basically, a surgical diathermy machine consists of a frequency power oscillator. The earlier types of diathermy machines consisted of spark gap oscillators, and we'll look into these types in the next model. And this, for their action, surgical diathermy machine depend upon the heating effect of electric current. When high frequency current flows through the sharp edge of the wire loop or band loop or the point of the needle into the tissue, there is a high concentration of current at this point, and the tissue is heated to such an extent that the cells which are immediately under the electrode are torn apart by the boiling of the cell fluid. And there is a high concentration at this point, so the tissue is heated to such an extent, okay, and the indifferent electrode establishes a large area contact with the patient and the RF current and is therefore dispersed so that the very little heat is developed at this electrode. And this type of tissue separation forms the basis of electrosurgical heating. And one more point which I want to mention here is desiccation and in the coagulation and fulgurations, or the different types of diathermy methods. Whereas in the microwave diathermy unit, the signal used for cutting or coagulation will be in the microwave range. And in order to facilitate identification of each mode of operation, the machines incorporates the audio tone generator, and the tone signals are derived from the counter at 1 kHz and 500 Hz and 250 Hz, and the isolator switch provides isolator switching control between the active hand switch and the rest of the unit. A high frequency transformer coupled power oscillators can be used in the surgical diathermy, in which the isolated output winding produces a DC voltage. The load put on the DC output by the hand switch is reflected back to the oscillator, accomplishing the isolator switching. There is a provision to interrupt the power output if so desired. So besides these basic functional units, logical circuits are used to receive the external logic control signals and to operate the oscillating relays, and gives a visual indication to determine the alarm conditions. The logic circuits receive information from the foot switch and finger switch and alarm sensing points. A thermostat is sometimes mounted on the power amplifier heatsink, and in case of over temperature, it becomes open circuited, signaling an alarm and interrupting the output. Thank you.